The air inside the Manhattan courtroom in 1995 is a universe away from the twinkling Christmas lights of a suburban Chicago street or the booby-trapped corridors of a New York brownstone. It is a sterile, suffocating environment, heavy with the scent of old paper, floor polish, and the quiet, simmering rage of a family tearing itself apart. There are no cameras permitted, a small mercy in a life that has been stripped of all privacy. But the gravity of the proceedings radiates through the thick wooden doors, feeding a media frenzy waiting outside. At the center of this quiet, devastating storm sits a boy who is simultaneously the plaintiff, the victim, and the prize. Macaulay Culkin, at 15 years old, is a ghost haunting his own life. The cherubic face that launched a billion-dollar franchise is now pale and drawn. His eyes, once so expressive and mischievous on screen, are weary and guarded. He has committed no crime. He is here to perform the single most profound and courageous act of his young life, to legally sever his parents from the fortune he, and he alone, has earned. He is here to fire his own father and mother. This is not a simple legal procedure. It is the tragic, inevitable climax of a childhood that was never a childhood at all, but a relentless, high-stakes business venture. On one side of the room sits his mother, Patricia Bentrup, the woman who traveled with him and managed his daily life on set. On the other, his father and manager, Christopher "Kit" Culkin, the man whose failed acting ambitions and tyrannical control had been the driving force and the corrosive poison of Macaulay's entire existence. They are no longer a couple. They are warring factions, and their primary battleground is the life and career of their son. They are locked in a bitter public custody dispute over their 7 children, but the unspoken, screaming subtext of the entire affair is money. Specifically, the 15% management fee from Macaulay's earnings. A colossal sum that Kit Culkin had controlled with an iron fist. The boy who played Kevin McAllister, the resourceful child who brilliantly fought off burglars with paint cans and tar, is now using that same fierce intelligence to protect himself from a far more intimate and devastating threat. He is not merely a witness in his parents' divorce, he has filed his own petition. He is asking the court to block both parents from any further control over his career and his earnings, to have an impartial executor placed in charge of his approximately $17 million trust fund. It is an unprecedented, almost surreal move for a child star, a public declaration that the fairy tale of his life was in fact a horror story of exploitation and greed. This moment in the courtroom is the quiet implosion of a global phenomenon. It is the story of a boy who became the primary breadwinner for his large family before he was 10, a global commodity before he hit puberty, and a burnt-out, deeply disillusioned veteran of the Hollywood wars before he was old enough to get a driver's license. The world saw a charming, impossibly rich kid living a dream that was the envy of millions. The grim reality was a child laboring under the immense psychological weight of being his family's sole source of stability, a boy whose professional success was the only glue holding a dysfunctional family together. And when that success began to wane, the entire structure collapsed. His decision here is not born of teenage rebellion or malice. It is an act of profound desperation. The only move left for a boy who realized that the only way to stop his parents from fighting over the golden goose was to announce that the goose would no longer be laying any golden eggs. He was yanking the emergency brake on a runaway train, not just to save himself, but to end the war being fought in his name. The question that hangs in the stale courtroom air is not just how it came to this, but how a child so young could be forced to make a choice so devastatingly adult. The answer begins in a cramped New York apartment, long before the world knew his name, with the quiet, simmering ambition of a father who saw his son not as a child, but as a second chance at his own failed dreams. To understand the 15-year-old who coolly and methodically dismantled his own career to save himself, one must first understand the world that forged him. Macaulay Culkin was born on August 26, 1980 in New York City, into a life that was a world away from the glamour he would come to define. He was the third of 7 children born to Christopher Kit Culkin and Patricia Bentrup, a sprawling, chaotic family squeezed into a small 2-bedroom railroad-style apartment on the Upper East Side. The apartment was so cramped that the children slept in bunk beds lined up in the windowless hallway that connected the rooms. It was a life of financial precarity and enforced intimacy, a world where privacy was a non-existent luxury. At the center of this world was the towering, often terrifying figure of Kit Culkin. A former child actor himself, Kit's own career had been a footnote in the annals of show business. He had danced in George Balanchine's School of American Ballet and appeared in a few off-Broadway productions and minor film roles. But his ambitions had far outstripped his success. He was a man defined by a deep well of bitterness and a fierce, unfulfilled hunger for the recognition he felt he had been denied. That hunger, that frustration was channeled with a laser-like intensity onto his children. He saw them not as individuals but as an acting troupe, a stable of potential stars who could achieve the success that had eluded him. Patricia, his partner, they never married, managed the chaotic household while Kit managed the dream. He was not a supportive stage dad who gently encouraged his children's interests. He was a drill sergeant. From an impossibly young age, the Culkin children were pushed into a relentless cycle of auditions for commercials, plays, and films. It was a strange, nomadic existence within their own city, shuttling from one casting call to another. Macaulay, or Mac as he was known, quickly emerged as the one with the undeniable spark. He possessed a natural charisma, a sharp intelligence, and a mischievous, almost feral charm that the camera adored. He was preternaturally gifted, able to memorize long passages of dialogue and take direction with an eerie professionalism. He landed his first professional stage role at the age of 4 in an off-Broadway play. His childhood was not one of parks, playdates, and scraped knees. It was one of dusty theaters, drafty rehearsal halls, and the constant, draining pressure to perform, to please, to land the part. He was the family's best hope, and he felt the weight of that responsibility from his earliest memories. The family's financial situation was often dire, making the pressure on young Mac even more intense. He became the primary breadwinner before he could reliably tie his own shoelaces. Kit, now acting as his son's full-time manager, negotiated his contracts with a ferocious, often alienating aggression that would become his trademark. He was a man who seemed to relish confrontation, who saw the industry not as a creative community but as a hostile entity from which every dollar had to be forcibly extracted. This adversarial approach would make him one of the most hated men in Hollywood, but in the early days, it worked. Mac steadily booked jobs, appearing in a series of television shows and films, including a memorable turn as the inquisitive nephew in the 1989 John Candy comedy, Uncle Buck. It was on the set of Uncle Buck that the trajectory of his life changed forever. The film's legendary writer-director John Hughes, the king of the 1980s teen movie, was mesmerized by him. Hughes saw in this small 8-year-old boy not just a precocious child actor, but a comedic genius with impeccable timing and an old soul's understanding of the camera. The story, now a part of Hollywood lore, is that during the filming of a single memorable scene where Mac's character interrogates the hulking John Candy through a mail slot, Hughes saw not just a funny kid but a future star. An entire movie encapsulated in that one small face. He saw a boy with the charisma, intelligence, and vulnerability to carry a film entirely on his own. The idea for a movie about a young boy accidentally left behind by his family at Christmas began to form in Hughes's mind, and he began writing the script with only one actor in mind, The project was called Home Alone. Home. It would make Macaulay Culkin a household name, a global phenomenon, and the possessor of a childhood that would be sacrificed at the altar of its success. The script for Home Alone was born not in a lengthy, deliberative process, but in a flash of pure inspiration, a testament to the prolific genius of John Hughes. During the production of Uncle Buck, Hughes found himself captivated by the young Macaulay Culkin. He saw a child who possessed an almost preternatural understanding of comedy, a boy who could convey a world of thought with a simple glance or a raised eyebrow. The iconic mail slot interrogation scene in Uncle Buck became the seed. Hughes began to wonder, what if this incredibly resourceful and charismatic kid was left to his own devices not just for a scene, but for an entire movie? The idea took hold, and in a legendary burst of creativity, Hughes wrote the first draft of Home Alone in just over a week. He had a production deal at Warner Brothers and presented the script, with Macaulay firmly in mind as the star, as a relatively modest family comedy with a budget of around $10 million. But the notoriously cautious machinery of Hollywood almost killed the project before it began. As pre-production commenced, the budget crept up, inching past the $10 million mark to a projected $14 million. For Warner Brothers, this was a red line. They saw the film as a significant risk, a comedy that relied entirely on the unproven box office draw of a 9-year-old child. They refused the budget increase, and in a move that would become one of the great what-ifs in cinematic history, shut down the production. For a moment, it seemed Kevin McAllister's adventure would never happen. But Hughes, who believed deeply in the project, engaged in a bit of sly corporate espionage. Without officially informing Warner Brothers, he quietly shopped the script to a rival studio, 20th Century Fox. Fox, sensing the potential for a holiday classic, immediately greenlit the project with the higher budget. The film was saved, and Warner Brothers had unknowingly let a future cultural and financial behemoth slip through its fingers. With the film now at Fox, director Chris Columbus was brought on board. Columbus, a protege of Steven Spielberg and the writer of classics like Gremlins and The Goonies, had a knack for blending comedy with genuine heart. While Hughes had written the role of Kevin McAllister specifically for Macaulay, Columbus, as a matter of due diligence, insisted on a full casting call. He auditioned over 200 other young actors for the part. This extensive search, however, only served to confirm what Hughes already knew. No one else was Kevin. Macaulay possessed a unique combination of vulnerability and cocky intelligence that was essential for the character. The role was his. His younger brother, Kieran Culkin, was also cast in the smaller role of the bedwetting cousin Fuller, a part he would later joke he barely remembered filming. The production itself, which took place in the winter of 1990 in the suburbs of Chicago, was a complex undertaking. The crew transformed a real house in Winnetka, Illinois, into a character in its own right, a battleground of ingenious Rube Goldberg-esque booby traps. The slapstick violence, while hilarious on screen, required meticulous planning and dangerous stunt work. Stunt doubles for both Macaulay and the Wet Bandits, played by Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern, were used extensively. Stern famously recalled the excruciating pain of having to step barefoot on a nail. It was a rubber prop, but still painful. And the genuine terror of the tarantula scene, which was real. Joe Pesci, a celebrated dramatic actor known for his intense roles in Martin Scorsese films, brought a surprising and at times unsettling level of method acting to the set. To foster a genuine sense of fear in his young co-star, Pesci intentionally avoided Macaulay, wanting the on-screen dynamic between the intimidating burglar and the frightened child to feel as real as possible. This approach famously culminated in a scene where Pesci's character hangs Kevin on a coat hook and threatens to bite his fingers off. In one take, Pesci accidentally bit Macaulay's finger, leaving him with a small, permanent scar, a physical reminder of the often blurry line between performance and reality. Adding to the film's surprising depth was the iconic score by the legendary composer John Williams. Williams created a soundtrack that was at once mischievous, grand, and full of heartfelt Christmas warmth. His score elevated the film from a simple slapstick comedy to a timeless holiday classic, imbuing the chaos with an undercurrent of emotion and loneliness that resonated deeply with audiences. This emotional core was further strengthened by a subplot that was not in Hughes's original script, but was added by Columbus, the story of Kevin's feared neighbor, Old Man Marley. The scenes where Kevin helps the lonely old man reconnect with his estranged family provided the film with its soul, a crucial counterpoint to the cartoonish violence of the main plot. When Home Alone was released in November 1990, the studio's modest expectations were immediately shattered. The film didn't just open at number 1, it stayed there. For an astonishing, unprecedented 12 consecutive weeks, it was the number 1 film in America. It steamrolled all competition, including major holiday blockbusters. It was a true word-of-mouth phenomenon in a pre-social media age, a film that families and children returned to see again and again. The final box office tally was astronomical, but the cultural impact was even greater. Macaulay Culkin was no longer a promising child actor. He was a global icon, his face plastered on everything from lunchboxes and action figures to video games. He had become, in an instant, the very definition of childhood stardom. But this explosion of fame and wealth was not a blessing for the Culkin family. It was an accelerant poured onto an already smoldering fire. The $17 million fortune Macaulay would amass was a sum so vast it warped the family's reality. And at the center of this new reality was Kit Culkin, now transformed from a frustrated stage dad into one of the most powerful and feared managers in Hollywood. The success of Home Alone had validated his brutal adversarial approach. He now had the ultimate bargaining chip, the most famous child in the world. And he began to play the game with a terrifying new level of aggression. The charming, funny kid the world saw on screen was now the centerpiece of a high-stakes business, and the price of that business would be the very normalcy his character, Kevin McAllister, so desperately missed on Christmas morning. The global adoration that followed Home Alone was a tidal wave, lifting Macaulay Culkin to a level of fame that was not just unprecedented for a child, but for almost any star in Hollywood history. The world was gripped by Culkin mania. His face was inescapable, his every move chronicled by a media that was rapidly discovering the immense profitability of celebrity-focused content. With this fame came a seismic shift in power. The Culkin family, once a struggling clan in a cramped apartment, was now a Hollywood dynasty, and Kit Culkin, the failed actor, was its newly crowned tyrannical king. He wielded his son's fame not like a shield, but like a battering ram, and his first target was the very industry that had made his son a star. Macaulay's first project after Home Alone was the 1991 drama My Girl, a film that represented a significant and strategic departure. It was a chance to prove he was more than just the funny kid from a Christmas movie. The film was a tender, nostalgic look at childhood innocence, but it was also a story steeped in melancholy, dealing with themes of death and first love. The role required a level of emotional vulnerability that surprised audiences, and the film is now legendary for 2 key scenes. Macaulay's character delivering the first on-screen kiss of his career, and his character's shocking, tragic death from an allergic reaction to bee stings. The latter scene was a cultural trauma for a generation of young viewers, the moment they realized their beloved Kevin McAllister was not invincible. The film was a box office success, and it proved Macaulay's dramatic range. but behind the scenes it was the first major battleground for Kit Culkin's newfound power. He negotiated a then astounding $1 million salary for his son, a tenfold increase from his Home Alone pay, signaling to the industry that the days of easy deals were over. This was merely the opening salvo. The true test of Kit's power came with the inevitable sequel, Home Alone 2. Lost in New York, the negotiations were famously brutal. Kit held the entire production hostage, demanding a salary for Macaulay that shattered all previous records for a child actor. A reported $4.5 million, plus a percentage of the gross profits. 20th Century Fox, knowing the franchise was worthless without its star, was forced to capitulate. The film, released in 1992, was another colossal financial success, though it was largely seen by critics as a bigger, less charming retread of the original. For Macaulay, it was a grueling production that cemented his status as a global cash cow. But the victory had emboldened Kit, transforming his aggressive negotiating style into something far more toxic and destructive. He was no longer just fighting for his son's salary. He was now attempting to leverage Macaulay's fame to launch the careers of his other children. This became known in Hollywood as the Culkin Clause. For studios to secure Macaulay for a film, they would often have to agree to consider his siblings for other roles in the same production. His sister Quinn and brother Rory were given parts in the 1993 thriller The Good Son. It was a move that bred deep resentment within the industry. He was seen as a bully, a man shamelessly using his golden goose to force his other, less talented children onto an unwilling industry. He made enemies of powerful studio heads, producers, and casting directors, people whose relationships were essential for long-term career survival. He was burning bridges with a scorched earth intensity, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that the fire would eventually consume his son's career. The psychological toll on Macaulay was immense. He was living in a surreal bubble of extreme wealth and suffocating control. While his father battled with studio executives, Mac was grappling with a level of fame that was fundamentally isolating. He couldn't go to a park, a store, or a movie theater without being mobbed. It was during this period that he formed a close and later controversial friendship with Michael Jackson. Jackson's Neverland Ranch became a sanctuary for him, a fantasy land where he could escape the adult pressures of his own life. Their bond was forged in the shared, bizarre reality of childhood superstardom, a reality no one else could possibly understand. Jackson, who had also been pushed into performing by an aggressive father, saw a kindred spirit in the young boy. For Mac, Neverland was one of the few places he could simply be a kid, away from the watchful eyes of his father and the demands of his career. Desperate to break the Kevin McAllister typecast, Macaulay made a daring and dangerous artistic choice. He agreed to star in The Good Son, a dark psychological thriller in which he would play Henry, a cherubic-looking but deeply psychopathic and evil child who terrorizes his cousin, played by Elijah Wood. Kit Culkin had to fight tooth and nail for the role, as the studio was terrified of shattering the family-friendly image of their biggest star. The production was fraught with tension, and the film, released in 1993, was a shocking departure for audiences. They were not ready to see the heroic Kevin McAllister as a cold-blooded, remorseless killer. While his performance was chillingly effective, the film received mixed reviews and underperformed at the box office. It was a sign that the public was not interested in seeing Macaulay grow up, especially not in such a disturbing fashion. This professional stumble was followed by a string of outright flops in 1994. Getting Even with Dad and the live-action adaptation of the comic book Richie Rich were both critical and commercial failures. The films felt tired, formulaic attempts to recapture the old magic. But the spark was gone. The public's fascination was waning. He was no longer the cute, precocious kid. He was an awkward teenager, and the industry that had built him up was now beginning to turn on him, partly due to his box office decline, and largely due to the immense toxicity of his father. The Culkin brand was becoming poisonous. The money machine, which had been printing cash for 4 straight years, began to sputter and slow. For Kit, whose identity and power were entirely wrapped up in his son's success, this was a catastrophe. For Macaulay, a boy who was 15 years old and felt like he had already lived an entire lifetime, it was the opening he had been waiting for. It was his chance to escape. The years following Macaulay Culkin's self-imposed exile were a quiet, protracted, and often difficult search for the normalcy that had been stolen from him. For a world accustomed to the constant glare of his fame, his absence was a void. He became a kind of urban legend, a whatever happened to story. But for Mac, this obscurity was a hard-won sanctuary. After finishing high school, he drifted, embracing the simple, anonymous rhythms of a young life in New York City. He got married at the tender age of 17 to actress Rachel Miner, a youthful attempt to build the stable family unit he had never known. The marriage was short-lived, ending in divorce just 2 years later, another casualty of a young man trying to navigate the wreckage of a deeply unconventional life. He largely stayed away from acting, save for a few forays into stage work and small independent films, choices that seemed driven by artistic curiosity rather than a desire to reclaim his former glory. He was deliberately choosing projects that were the antithesis of the blockbuster machine that had defined his childhood. But the ghosts of his past were never far behind. The most significant of these was his close, complicated friendship with Michael Jackson. When Jackson faced trial on child molestation charges in 2005, Culkin was called to testify as a defense witness. He staunchly defended Jackson, testifying that he had slept in Jackson's bed numerous times as a child, but that nothing inappropriate had ever happened. It was another surreal public spectacle, forcing a young man who craved privacy back into the center of a global media circus, this time to defend the legacy of his equally famous and equally misunderstood friend. This period was also marked by his own inevitable collision with the law. In 2004, in Oklahoma City, he was arrested for possession of marijuana and a small amount of controlled substances for which he did not have a prescription. The mugshot from that arrest, showing a gaunt, long-haired, and world-weary 24-year-old, went viral. It was the image the tabloid world had been waiting for, the proof they needed for their predetermined narrative of the tragic, drug-addled former child star. The story fit the classic Hollywood template, the one that had been applied to countless child actors before him. The public, for the most part, accepted this narrative without question. The golden boy had fallen. It was a sad but predictable story. But what the world failed to understand was that this was not the story of a man desperately clinging to fame and spiraling into addiction. It was the story of a man who had already rejected fame and who was now navigating the complex long-term trauma of his upbringing. His struggles were not the result of losing the spotlight. They were the direct result of having been in it. He was not a cliché. He was a survivor, a veteran of a psychological war, trying to find his footing on a landscape of normalcy he had never been taught how to navigate. The world saw a cautionary tale, but the reality was far more nuanced and profound. He was a man who had been forced to parent his own parents, who had to sue for his own financial freedom, and who was now trying, clumsily and privately, to piece together a life for himself from the fragments of a childhood that had been sold to the highest bidder. He began to quietly and on his own terms re-engage with the world. He started a satirical pop culture website and podcast called Bunny Ears, a quirky, ironic project that showcased his sharp, sardonic wit. He formed a comedy rock band called the Pizza Underground, which famously performed parodies of Velvet Underground songs with pizza-themed lyrics. These projects were not designed for mass appeal. They were strange, niche, and deeply personal, the work of a man who was no longer interested in pleasing a global audience. He was creating for the sheer joy of it, for an audience of like-minded weirdos. He was, for the first time in his life, in complete creative control, and he was using that control to be as strange and uncommercial as he wanted. It was a defiant act of artistic deprogramming. He was systematically dismantling the very idea of being Macaulay Culkin, the brand, and replacing it with something far more authentic, far more interesting, and far more human. He was finally finding his own voice, not the one that had been written for him by John Hughes or managed by his father, but the wry, intelligent, and deeply funny voice that had been there all along, buried beneath the weight of global fame. The final act of Macaulay Culkin's story is not a comeback in the traditional Hollywood sense. There was no triumphant return to blockbuster films, no tearful interview on a talk show couch designed to solicit public sympathy. Instead, his reemergence has been a slow, deliberate, and deeply authentic process of reclamation, a quiet revolution conducted entirely on his own terms. He did not come back to Hollywood. He allowed a select, curious part of the world back into his own life, but the doors were now guarded by a profound sense of self-awareness and a hard-won peace. This new chapter has been defined by his intelligent and wry engagement with his own legacy. He began to selectively appear in projects that allowed him to subvert and comment on his own myth, proving that the gifted actor was still very much alive, just waiting for a part that interested him. He had a memorable, well-received role in the 10th season of the popular TV series American Horror Story in 2021, a part that was both bizarre and physically demanding, showing he had lost none of his on-screen commitment. He made guest appearances in acclaimed comedies like The Righteous Gemstones. These were not star vehicles. They were clever, character-driven parts chosen by an artist, not a brand. But his most brilliant performance has been as himself, using the internet as his stage to finally take control of the narrative. In 2018, he starred in a viral ad for Google Assistant that became a cultural phenomenon. The ad brilliantly recreated iconic scenes from Home Alone, with the adult Macaulay now using modern technology to effortlessly outsmart the burglars. The ad was a stroke of genius. It was funny, deeply nostalgic, and most importantly, it showed a man who was finally comfortably in on the joke. He was no longer running from the ghost of Kevin McAllister. He was inviting him over for dinner and showing him how to use a smartphone. It was a public declaration that he had made peace with the past, and it was a masterpiece of self-aware branding. The most profound and meaningful aspect of his renaissance, however, has been profoundly personal and largely private. After years of navigating the complex terrain of his own trauma, and a youth spent in the glare of the public eye, he found a quiet, stable, and deeply loving partnership with the actress Brenda Song. Their relationship was a sanctuary. Song, another former child star who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the Disney machine, was one of the few people on Earth who could truly understand the bizarre, artificial reality of his upbringing. Their bond was not forged in the flashbulbs of a red carpet, but in a shared experience and a mutual desire for a normal private life. In April 2021, they welcomed their first child, a son named Dakota, in a touching tribute to Macaulay's late sister, who had died in a car accident in 2008. Near the end of 2022, they quietly welcomed a second son, Carson. The boy who had been forced to be the adult in his own chaotic family was now a father himself, with the chance to create the safe, loving, and stable childhood that had been denied to him. Fatherhood became his anchor, the purpose he had been searching for. He has spoken with profound, unironic joy about the experience of being a hands-on, stay-at-home dad whose life now revolves around family schedules and the simple, beautiful routines of a life lived for others. This quiet, personal victory received a stunning public validation on December 1st, 2023. On that day, Macaulay Culkin, the boy who had walked away from Hollywood almost 30 years prior, returned to receive one of its highest honors, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The event was not a somber reflection on a tragic past, but a joyous celebration of a life fully reclaimed. He stood there, no longer the gaunt, haunted figure from the old mugshot, but a healthy, happy, and well-dressed man surrounded by his loving family. The speeches were deeply emotional. Catherine O'Hara, who had played his on-screen mother in Home Alone, gave a heartfelt tribute, affectionately calling him "my dear son." But the most powerful moment came when Macaulay himself spoke. After thanking the industry, his voice cracked with emotion as he turned to his partner, Brenda Song. "You are absolutely everything," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "You're my champion. You're the only person happier for me today than I am. You're not only the best woman I've ever known, you're the best person I've ever known. You've given me all my purpose. You've given me a family." In that single, heartfelt, and public declaration, the entire story came full circle. The lonely boy from the courtroom who had fought to protect his fortune from a family torn apart by greed was now a man defining his life's purpose not by wealth or fame, but by the love and family he had built for himself. The curse had been broken, not by reclaiming a career, but by reclaiming a life. The legacy of Macaulay Culkin is a radical and profoundly inspiring one, a narrative that has slowly, deliberately, and triumphantly rewritten itself over the past 3 decades. For a long time, his story was used as the ultimate cautionary tale of child stardom, the quintessential example of the curse that afflicts those who achieve too much, too soon. He was the poster child for the tragic flame-out narrative that the public both pities and secretly craves. But with the passage of time, and with the benefit of his own intelligent, wry self-analysis, we can now see his story for what it truly is. Not a tragedy of failure, but an unprecedented epic of survival. He is not a cautionary tale. He is a roadmap for how to escape one. Macaulay Culkin did not lose his way or succumb to the pressures of fame in the classic, cliched sense. He was a clear-eyed victim of a toxic and exploitative system, and he made a conscious, almost impossibly brave decision to save himself. He is one of the very few child megastars who did not flame out in a blaze of public self-destruction or desperately cling to a fading spotlight for decades. He saw the fire coming and at the age of 14 made the rational choice to walk out of the building and lock the door behind him. His story forced a conversation about the dark mechanics of childhood stardom and parental exploitation in a way that had never been seen before. The details of his legal battle to protect his own earnings from his warring parents shone a harsh, unforgiving light on the idea that a child's talent can be treated as a family commodity, a natural resource to be plundered. He was a boy who had to become a man to protect the child within, a profound inversion of the natural order. What makes his legacy so unique is not just that he survived, but how he survived. He did not fight to reclaim his place in the Hollywood hierarchy. He simply rejected the hierarchy altogether. His wilderness years were not a retreat into oblivion, but a long, necessary pilgrimage toward an authentic self. His quirky, ironic reemergence through projects like The Pizza Underground and Bunny Ears was a masterclass in narrative control. He refused to be the tragic figure the world wanted him to be. Instead, he became the wry, self-aware narrator of his own absurd story, using humor and intelligence as his shield and his sword. He disarmed the world's pity by proving he was in on the joke. Ultimately, his story challenges our very definition of success in a culture that worships fame and fortune above all else. By that metric, Macaulay Culkin's career peaked in 1992. But by the metric of a life well lived, His success is happening right now, in the quiet, untelevised moments with his family. His greatest achievement was not the box office gross of Home Alone. It was his decision to walk away from it all to build a life of peace, love, and genuine happiness. It was a quiet, revolutionary act of rebellion against the entire value system of modern celebrity. The final enduring image of Macaulay Culkin is no longer the cherubic boy with his hands on his face, screaming in mock terror. It is the image of a 43-year-old man, his eyes wet with tears of gratitude, looking at his partner and his children and finding his purpose. He did not just play the boy who survived being left behind. He is the man who survived, and he did it by finally and triumphantly choosing to go home.